Good morning. It is 6:11, and here we are at the old watering trough. 6:11. Give us this day our daily bread. I hope that's what you're finding as you get into the Word. You're finding that God is the one that gives you the bread. What we do here is a study to just facilitate, number one, learning. Also, hopefully, give you some ideas and concepts on how to study, rather than just kind of just doing a devotional. And the one thing there are a lot of good materials out there. Please, I hope you hear what I'm saying. But there's nothing better than you digging it out yourself rather than someone else mixing it up and giving it to you. Okay? And so I hope that, what we're doing here is just kind of tantalizing the taste buds, and you're saying, you know what, I want more. So that's why on purpose, in one fashion, I give it a very small amount and try not to go above 15 minutes, and then you can run with it after that. I've always had the theory that never give everybody everything all at once. Give it to them so that they feel like, you know what, that was good. I want to come back for more. I want to come back for more. And so that's how God works with us, and I hope that you're seeing that in your studies. Today we take on a topic that is very, very close to my heart, and I want to give a default here. I want to just kind of say that it's going to deal with pastors, okay? And this is dealing with Jeremiah, the time of Jeremiah. We're going to look at three texts that indicate the culture of those areas, those times, and how the minister had to deal with, or what he was seeing in the midst. Excuse me. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a great communicator of some of these things. I tend to come across bold and brash. I sometimes come across arrogant in these areas, and I really try to hold the horses. So if you hear that in me today, just understand it's just the passion of what I'm going to be dealing with. But as a pastor that's been in ministry now nearly 30 years, over 30 years, it's become ever so prevalent that what's happening in the churches is a lot to do with the training of the pastors. And I'm going to just make a quick confession. Early in the ministry, it was the emphasis of the group that I was running with to get guys right out of college, ordain them, and go send them out into pastorate or to start churches. Quite frankly, I think that was a wrong practice, because you had a lot of guys going out that were just not equipped, and they were running into giants that they did not know how to face. They had not first run into their bears and their lions before they ran into their Goliaths. And there's a lot of principles that were lost. Now, that's on one side, the poor equipping of pastors, and I see a lot of that today. And I don't mean that as a negative, I'm better than you attitude. It's just a critique from a guy that's been in ministry 30-some years, pastoring in the Northeast. I know there are other guys more experienced, have greater abilities, but from where I standpoint, I look at some things and I say, that's going to be troublesome, specifically with younger men in ministry. But they also have to plot it out and work it out and come to some understanding. And as long as they're faithful to God, God will be faithful to them, and they will learn those lessons. The other side of it is that pastors start to compromise. In other words, they get so weary in doing the work and the battles that go with it that they begin to just say, do whatever, I'm going to take care of myself, and I'll just show up and do the teaching and whatever. So let's just look real quick at the word pastor. The pastor we're going to be using out of Jeremiah 23. The etymology of that word means just one who cares for the flock. He's a herdsman, he's a shepherd. Out of Strong's, it's one who tends to the flock, feeds, befriends, even shears. Okay, now, we know then from this the pastor should be one who's providing, protecting, guiding. Psalm 23 is a great place to go to. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Remember, great indicator of how the Lord is with us and how a pastor should be with the Lord's flock. And then David is a good example as well. Okay? David is a good example as well. Now, to springboard this, we're going to go to Ezekiel. Remember, Ezekiel and Jeremiah were in the same time frames, dealing in the same region, although they were dealing with two different groups of people. And notice here this from Ezekiel 34. These are powerful. Any pastor or anyone, I even tell people before you even go in the ministry, you need to read Jeremiah 23 and Ezekiel 34, because God is hammering the pastors. He is just like, it's you, it's you, it's you. And when you go to Malachi and you realize that when you start reading through the text, God is not as angry with the people of Judah for their offerings as much as he is with the priest who allowed the offerings to come like that to God. And so you see that the gatekeeper is the pastor in a lot of what takes place. And if that pastor doesn't have a fire to him, that pastor doesn't have conviction, that pastor doesn't know the Word of God, that pastor doesn't know God, there's always going to be hiccups. There's going to be problems. Now here's a consequence of it. Notice in verse 5. It says here, they were scattered because there is no shepherd. They became meat to all the beasts of the fields when they were scattered. A lot of times, and let me just do a caveat here, okay? You never see anywhere in the Bible where the sheep scold the shepherd. Just telling you that. Who takes care of the shepherd? God does. Even David, a good example as a shepherd, sins with Bathsheba. The people know it. His crime was huge. But God deals with the shepherd, okay? And even when we have this doctrinal problem in the New Testament between Peter and Paul, we don't see anybody else scolding Peter. We see Paul, an equal, scolding Peter, okay? I tell our folks, look, as a pastor, I have every right to go to another pastor and say, you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. And they have every right to come to me and say, you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong. I think everything else, if I have a problem with a pastor, should be done through Matthew 18. Go to them privately, bring two, and even Paul writes to Timothy later on, he says, never hear an accusation against a pastor unless there are two, okay? Because the pastor is the target. And let me just add one more thing here and I know trying to press a lot into this short time, but I don't really want to spend too much time here. The pastor has been called by God, and you remember that we hear in the New Testament, the pastor is like the ox that just keeps treading out the corn. He's just going around and around the post, milling the corn. That means that pastor is absolutely dependent on God for safety, for feeding, for protection. Unlike the rest of the oxen who can go and graze wherever they feel like in the field, that pastor has no choice but to stay tied to that post, because at the will of the mercy of his master. That means he's also very vulnerable. People can kick dust in his face. People can throw stones. And by the way, can I just say, the pastor is one of the most vulnerable people in the church. Most times you don't even come close to hearing and knowing the criticism that the pastor has to bear in the church. People feel, especially in this day and age, you know how they're throwing, we hear so much thrown at our government officials out of anger, and why would you think it's any different with pastors? People have a tendency to say, hey, you're going to get it. And so this is why we have a lot of issues with pastors, okay? So there's so many dynamics involved. So let me just show you a couple of things. This comes out of Statistics in Ministry, and this was newly revised. But notice that 72 of pastors report working between 55 and 75 hours per week. 84 of the pastors feel they are on call 24/7. 80% believe pastoral ministry has negatively affected their families. 65% of pastors feel their families live in a glass house. 23% of pastors report being distant to their family. 78% of pastors report having their vacation and personal time interrupted. And you just can see it going on and on. Now, look at all these statistics, okay? These are all basically on the negative side that pastors are facing, all right? Thankfully, there's been some improvements over the years. 73% of churches are now treating their pastors better. That statistic has improved due to the advent of clergy appreciation, better education on the role of the pastor, denominational awareness to better supporting their pastors. 77% of pastors, especially millennials, are spending 20 or more hours with their families each week. 90% of pastors feel they are called in the place where they are called. Now, we have conflicting studies, but I can tell you from the groups I run with, there are a lot less people going into Bible colleges to study for ministry than ever before. We have a lot more bivocational pastors today, meaning they probably have to work full-time or at least half-time to help supplement the funds for their family, and yet still work almost full-time for the ministry. Okay, that puts a huge burden on them and on their wives and children especially. So I can understand why there is the temptation to put one foot in the house of God and one foot out of the house of God, and sometimes compromise in that area. So I'm very sympathetic to that. I was bivocational for 25 years at least myself, working 80 to 100 hours a week, and even today spend an awful lot of time working. But I'm not complaining, just saying I have a heart and compassion for it. Now let's jump ahead real quick to the time of Jesus, where we see here in Matthew chapter number 9, look at verse number 35. And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, healing sickness and every disease. And notice that phrase, among the people. He's among the people. But when he saw, being among the people, the multitudes, he was moved with compassion on them because they fainted. They were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Okay? So he is very concerned for what he sees. So remember, the culture of Ezekiel, the culture of Jesus Christ, both ministers of God, what is happening? There's been a breakdown in the leadership of the teaching of the things of God, okay? So now I've set the stage, and we're going to go back to Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 23. And there's no way we can cover everything, but again, let's start with where Jeremiah is in the culture. So it says, "Woe be unto the pastors that destroy and scatter the sheep of my pastures, saith the Lord. Therefore, thus saith the Lord of Israel against the pastors that feed my people. Ye have scattered my flock and driven them away, and have not visited them. Behold, I will visit upon you the evil of your doing, saith the Lord, and I will gather the remnant of my flock out of the countries, whether I have driven them, and will bring them again to their folds, and they shall be fruitful and increase, and I will set up shepherds over them, which shall feed them, and they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall they be lacking, saith the Lord." So, when it comes down to it, God is the over-shepherd. He is the head shepherd. And when he sees that his under-shepherds, the pastors, aren't doing what they're going to do, he will take care of his flock. And he will judge and bring chastisement upon those shepherds that are not doing what they're supposed to do. Here is one of my criticisms and critiques of pastors today. Pastors act too much like CEOs of businesses and managers of department stores than they do as pastors of their churches. The pastor is supposed to visit and be with his people. And if anyone knows me, that is the one thing that frustrates me most about the ministry where I'm at. And I love being where I'm at, but I was not called to be a school administrator. I was called to be a pastor. I had this staff meeting the other day, and I asked them, okay, what's your duty? What's your duty? What's your duty? And they all told me what their duties were. And I said, what's my duty? And they said, you're administrator of school. I said, you're wrong. I'm the pastor of this church, and this school needs an administrator. I am not to be that administrator. My job is to be a pastor, and it's time for me to get out into those fields and work with those sheep. So pray with me on that, because that is a huge burden and pressure, but it has to be done. If this church and the ministry that God's called us to is going to go forward, we need an administrator here that is doing the school work, and I need to go out and pastor. Now, I only have about a minute left. Take the time to read down through Jeremiah 23. You're going to find God just scolds these pastors. And who's the voice to the pastor? Jeremiah. Can you see what will happen out of that? Let me give you this other little tidbit. The government, I found in all my workings in the state of Vermont and working in government places, whether it be schools or working with the state of Vermont with our own daycare, they really do want to work with you. They've got enough on their plate that if we do things which are right, they're okay. You see, with Pontius Pilate, he didn't want to get involved in that whole mess with Jesus. He really didn't. And we even just saw that last week when we were studying Aquila and Priscilla. The guy didn't want to deal with Paul, right? The governor didn't want to deal with Paul of Achaia. They got enough on their plate. They don't want to get into this stuff unless we're doing something criminal for sure. And they should then. They don't want to deal with religious matters. Who are the ones that we need to be most concerned about? Those that are in religious leadership. Beware. Those are the ones that want to suppress and maintain power. They have not been the shepherd God has called them to be. So take the time to read it. I set this up because this is where they are. This is what Jeremiah is facing, and this sets the stage now for where this is going to go in this showdown, as it were, with Zedekiah. But the conduit to the government, to Zedekiah, and back to Jeremiah, is these pastors that are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Okay? Hope you have a great weekend. God bless you. Go with God. He's worth it. Let God go with you, and it is a blessing.